Good morning, an actual good morning to all of you, and welcome to the British Science Fiction Association Lecture. This is an annual humanities lecture, which has been held every year at Eastercon since 2009. It was founded by Tony Keane as a counterpart to the Science Fiction Foundation's Hay Lecture. This one invites an academic to speak on a topic of interest in the humanities to Eastercon attendees. That doesn't mean it has anything to do with science fiction or fantasy, although today's does. Professor Fiona Moore is a professor of business anthropology at Royal Holloway, University of London. She is also a BSFA award-winning writer and academic whose work has appeared in Clarkesworld, Asimov, Interzone, and 6 consecutive editions of the best of British science fiction. Her most recent fiction is the novel Rabbit in the Moon from Epic Publishing, and her most recent nonfiction is the book Management Lessons from Game of Thrones. Her previous publications include 1 novel, numerous articles in journals including Foundation, guidebooks to Blake 7, The Prisoner, Battlestar Galactica, and Doctor Who, 3 stage plays, and 4 audio plays. Today, Professor Moore will be speaking to us on Even the Smallest Person Can Change the Course of the Future, Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Lord of the Rings.
Much, Shana. And thank you all very much for coming. I understand there's something else interesting going on at the same time. So I'd also like to say hello to my time-traveling viewers on the catch-up later on. All right, so yes. I heard the laugh at the mention of management lessons from Game of Thrones. And that's kind of the intended aspect of it. You know, one of the things I found, that particular project started off because I was trying to find a way of teaching leadership concepts to my organization studies and human resource management students that made it interesting for me and for them. I started using examples from Game of Thrones instead of the usual examples that people tend to get in business textbooks. And before long, you know, people were actually voluntarily coming to the lectures rather than having to turn up for them. And well, that's the thing, you know, once you say management lessons from Game of Thrones, you laugh, and then you think, well, yeah, actually, there's a lot you can learn about management from fantasy and science fiction, but especially from fantasy that deals with strategy, battles, alliances, really, really brutal mergers, really, really brutal demergers, great big fiery things that burn, that spit flame. So for the last few years after that, people have been asking, what are you going to do for a follow-up? And this year, I finally got my ducks in a row for a project that I'd been thinking of for a follow-up from Management Lessons from Game of Thrones for a long time, which is Management Lessons from the Lord of the Rings. Because similarly, there's actually an awful lot that managers can learn from Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien, you know, was not writing in Middle-earth. You know, Tolkien was writing at a time when lots of people were having thoughts about organizations and industry and business and people and what to do about all of this. You know, so these the contemporary theories to Tolkien start bleeding through into Tolkien's work. And it's interesting to explore how that happens, what that does, and what he takes from his own society, puts in his work, and what we can now learn in a different but not too dissimilar context. So what I'm going to be using as the basis for my lecture today is effectively what will be Chapter 5 of Management Lessons from Lord of the Rings. Yes, this is the way of academia. You know, you try out your material on unsuspecting audiences before you commit it to paper. Two controversial or potentially controversial things about this book are that I am going to be riling up certain people's opinions by focusing on sustainability and diversity. And so Chapter 5 is going to be about diversity and Tolkien. And why does this matter? Why is this important and why now? Now, on the business side, diversity management as a conscious thing and deliberate thing has been going on for the last 40 years or more. And although we're definitely making progress, it's slow and incremental. When I'm not talking about elves and dragons, one of the things I write about is female leadership. And I can say statistically, we're seeing more and more women officially in charge of companies, but still statistically relative to the number of women in the population, it's you've got to wonder why. Also, this is something that, for various ideological reasons, is under attack in some quarters. Most famously, the current US regime is making a talking point of making a war on DEI, if you like, arguing that diversity management is, just kind of a frippery, it's a frill, it's coddling people, it's something that businesses should not be doing. And people need to know why it's not a luxury and why it is not, in fact, whatever Elon Musk and Donald Trump may say, it's not actually something that's unfair or, promoting the unqualified. And furthermore, if we're not succeeding with the diversity management tools we have, then we need new tools and we need new thinking on diversity. And so I'm hoping to get people thinking in new ways. Now, on the fandom side, though, parallel to all of this is that there's been a rise recently in appropriation of Tolkien on the far right, particularly Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. For some reason, they seem less interested in appropriating Farmer Giles of Ham. But the problem I see with this is not just that, but it's that the fight back, from what I can see, kind of concedes ground straight away. It focuses on reinterpretations and rejections. I've seen people just sort of actively say, the far right say, Tolkien is about white supremacy. And then people on the left respond and say, yeah, Tolkien's about white supremacy. So let's promote these other authors, or let's reinterpret Tolkien. And okay, but if you concede your opponent's main point to them straight away without even interrogating it, then I think you've lost ground. And I think we do need to be promoting other authors. They're great authors. The Water Outlaws by S.L. Huang, the Suyi Davies Okamboa's novels, I love, and we need to be promoting different sorts of fantasy, but we also need to be looking at the classics and seeing if they really are what the people who are appropriating saying they are. Okay, so for the next 10 minutes, I will quickly take you through diversity management, hopefully less, because I know you're all keen for me to get on to the elves. So, however, we all need to be starting from the same theoretical point. And yeah, don't worry, I'm going to be talking about these guys in a minute. But what is diversity management? Well, at its most basic, it's complying with laws on discrimination and inclusion. We have them. Businesses have to comply with them. In practice, they're more often, I'm afraid, honored in the breach than the observance, but nonetheless, there are laws and you can be held to account if you break them. More nebulously, it's about making a workplace inclusive, so for reasons that we'll get to in a minute, and also managing diversity in a workplace, because this is not episode 1 of Rings of Power. We do not all sort of dance and sing in a ring and hold hands. Differences are differences, and sometimes they rub up against people. So yeah, some myths and oversimplifications people may have about diversity management and why it matters and why it doesn't. Okay, you've all heard some variation, I'm sure, of that quote up top. I heard from distant acquaintance about the time a company hired an unqualified protected category rather than a qualified white man because of EDI, and chaos ensued and cats lived together and fire ran through the streets. The thing was, at first, when I heard the first couple of times I heard that, I thought, oh yeah. And then I started interrogating it and I started asking people for specifics. And after the third or fourth person who could not, in fact, give me specifics, I realized this was an urban myth, in the sense that it probably never actually really happened. But as an anthropologist, I can say that just because something didn't actually literally happen doesn't mean it isn't true. So the thing about an urban myth is not to say, oh, it's not real, it doesn't matter. It's to say, why is it real for some people? Why is it real for so many people? And I think it's real because the idea of diversity management, particularly in things like hiring and promotion, makes us uncomfortable. Because having been on the other side of the hiring table, I can tell you that once you get to the final round, it doesn't matter what protected characteristics somebody has. The 4 or 5 people you got on your shortlist are probably equally qualified for the job. So whenever you get your job, you can maybe think to yourself that you were the best in the room, but actually you weren't. You were just one of the best who got picked. And this makes both people outside the protected characteristics uncomfortable because maybe they're saying they're not as good as they think they are, and people with the protected characteristics uncomfortable because we're thinking, maybe they did just hire me because I'm a woman, or alternatively, I know they didn't, but maybe people will think they hired me because I was a woman, So it makes us all uncomfortable, and we need to not dismiss that discomfort. We need to look at it. And again, so why does this matter? Well, this picture is nothing directly to do with Tolkien, but those of you who are in the Doctor Who panels will probably recognize the people involved. That on the screen right there is John Nathan Turner, showrunner of Doctor Who, and that's costume designer June Hudson. And why I've got these two up here in the context of diversity management is that one is a woman and one is a gay man. And if you look at the history of television, the entire history of television is full of things with the very, very brilliant and talented gay men, lesbians, women, straight women, trans people, people of color, religious minorities, and everybody tremendously talented, tremendously doing tremendous amounts of work, and most of it being unrecognized relative to people who were a bit more palatable. It's the straight white man, whose name is on the end credits, and the dozens of others are less recognized. It's a straight white man in the history. When I was talking to one of my female CEOs the other day, she said, well, women have always led companies. It's just that the husband's name was on the masthead. And she's right. But the thing is, if we are doing business, and if business is a meritocracy, then we need to recognize who is doing the leadership. To use a blunt expression, you want to be talking to the organ grinder, not the monkey. And so, this is why these sorts of things actually matter. So a bit more disambiguation. The terms you hear a lot are EDI and DEI. Now, one thing I want to emphasize at the start is that the two are not interchangeable. EDI is actually a fairly specific concept for the UK business environment, and at its basics, most basics, it just refers to applying the Equalities Act 2010, which says that you should not treat somebody less favorably on the basis of one of the following protected characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, yes, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex or sexual orientation. That's it. And they define equality as equal job opportunities, so equal access to jobs, equal treatment in jobs, and also equal access to promotion, redundancy, reassignment, and so forth. Diversity means having a workplace with a range of people in it as justified. There are legal exceptions and the like, which we can get into the weeds of if we want to in the questions. And inclusion, more importantly, means ensuring everybody feels valued and ensuring that there is good employee voice. Now, DEI, first of all, it's slightly different. That's not equality that the E stands for, it's equity, which is a subtle difference that I'm going to get into when I get more into the Tolkien side of things. But yeah, it's not saying equality, it's saying equity. Equivalent treatment. Also, it's more loosely defined, and in the US, it tends to refer to the applications of a number of different laws and is further complicated with other state-level laws and regulations, which is another thing that's making the situation in the US messy right now. But in countries without specific laws, DEI tends to get used as a more general catch-all term for diversity management as it applies to businesses in the and particularly with regard to following the law in the letter, at least, if not the spirit. So the case for diversity management. Well, the legal case is clear. There are laws, you need to follow them, though I would emphasize that, you know, the moral case goes beyond the legal case, if you like. You know, you can follow the letter of the law and still not be inclusive. The moral case, again, fairly simply defined, you know, treat others as you would want to treat them. Everybody has a dignity. You know, we need to ensure that people are treated with dignity. But more importantly for the subject at hand at the moment is the business case. You know, contrary to what is being said in certain sections of the US at the moment, you know, Walt Disney does not have a rainbow cast in their Star Wars films because of some kind of principled stand. This is Disney. You know, principled stand is, I think, not in their corporate vocabulary. They are doing it because it sells. You know, they are doing it because, you know, people do want a story about a black girl Sith. You know, they want a story about a Hispanic hero in a mask with his single dad to a green adopted son. You know, behind the camera within the workplace, you know, there are lots and lots of good aspects to encouraging EDI. I've got this boring quote from ACAS, but I mean, some of the things my colleagues and I, when we were writing about leadership, women leadership, found, you know, we're not, no, you know, before you think I'm going to say women are better leaders. No, they're not. Women are more moral leaders. No, they're not. Have you heard of Mrs. Thatcher? You know, women, but what women are different leaders. Statistically, women are more likely to take risks as leaders, but they're more likely to take calculated risks. Women are often better at crisis management. Some of that may be the fact that they're learned. Some of this may be an issue when people become leaders, but women have different statistically have different focuses as leaders. Similarly, everybody, you know, has different experiences that people can't necessarily process if they haven't been through these experiences. And these are things that businesses can learn from. If all your design team are one single sort of person, then they're not going to think about what other sorts of people need. Crash test dummies for decades were built on male models, and you know, then eventually somebody finally asked why women were dying in greater numbers in car accidents, and started building smaller and curvier dummies. You know, but this is the sort of thing that if you aren't actually thinking, you know, kind of does this dummy look like the entire design team, that you're not necessarily thinking of. Similarly, there are other more nebulous things like that you can attract and keep better staff, you know, even outside of protected categories. If you've got a workplace that looks like people are respected, people have dialogue, people have different opinions, and they talk to each other, you know, then it's comfortable and inclusive. I can say my business school was the first business school to have a black female dean, and we've also got one of the highest rates of staff retention. You know, I'm not sure the two are necessarily disconnected. So before we get into Tolkien, we're about to, don't worry, you can wake up. There are four general, broadly speaking, approaches to diversity management that companies take. One is the non-intervention approach. This is the invisible hand of the market thing. You know, the market does not judge. The market seeks out talent. So it doesn't matter what package the talent comes in, you know, the talent will rise to the top. And this is not all entirely wrong. Like there are very examples of this working. Like I heard anecdotally about when American banks came into the city of London, they were not constrained by, you know, kind of the old boys network and who went to university. So they just promoted the people that were doing the good work. And so suddenly an awful lot of low-level female admins found themselves in senior management. So that does work, you know. John Nathan Turner, again, a few slides back. Claude is to the top, you know. But it does mean that, that we need to acknowledge that the invisible hand of the market is not, in fact, meritocratic. And there are a lot of barriers to talent rising to the top. And for every John Nathan Turner, there are a dozen of people who weren't so successful. Second approach is the one that's controversial, but it works. The equal opportunities approach. And that's the one that gets hammered in the press because that's the one that involves the quotas, you know, and the preferential lists and the saying, things like, if you have an all-male police force, then for the next 10 years, 30% of your hires shall be women, And the problem is, it is blunt and brute force, but it does work. It does actually get the people in. Does it get them rising? Well, you then have to get, in a different approach. You have to also recognize that the job does not end at getting in the door. It's also about putting people in the pipeline and getting people through. But nonetheless, that's what equal opportunity is about. Now, that approach came in mostly in the 80s. And then in the 90s, there was kind of a reaction to it, which is a very 90s sort of reaction, saying, well, let's look at intersectionality. We're all of us different. This straight white male guy is also a religious minority. So even though he passes, he also faces discrimination. So why are we looking at these protected categories and saying you shall have this many, why not take a more inclusive approach and look at each individual as a package of privilege and less privilege? And in some ways, this is a fair point that, some privilege is complicated and you can't just sort of go in there and say, we shall hire 30% women and not sort of say, are all these women from the same class? Are they all from the same ethnic group? And also, again, the Equalities Act 2010 only covers like 8 categories. There's an awful lot of people facing discrimination for reasons outside of those categories. But the problem is that the diversity approach does tend to be a bit more slippery. If you say, well, let's consider everybody in terms of as an individual in terms of their package, then that's an easy way to ignore the oppression of categories of people. So that's a problem. Then you've got the radical approach, which is probably the most effective, but it's the one that's least practiced, which is to basically say the problem is systematic, the problem is outside the company, and so what companies need to do is to become activists. Companies need to challenge discrimination outside of their bounds. And possibly this is what we're seeing right now in the US with companies like Disney and Costco fighting back against anti-EDI regulations. And I never thought I'd say go Harvard, but go Harvard. I went to University of Toronto and then to Oxford, They're not all that. This is examples of companies actually saying, no, we're going to fight the system, So arguably, we can say that all of this is kind of part of a package, and possibly the best way forward is to do all of it in different ways and different measures. Okay, so here's the bit you're here for. Tolkien. So here's the case against. This is why people come out and say Tolkien's racist, Tolkien's sexist, Tolkien can get in the bin. Because there's an awful lot of stuff that you read The Lord of the Rings appendices and various other bits and pieces, and you go, ay! Because, an awful lot of Sauron's followers from the men category are black. They're Easterlings and Southrons, and so they sort of code as Africans and Middle Easterners to our non-Middle Earth point of view. There's literally 5 named women in the series, 6 if you count Shelob. And Shelob is basically a walking vagina dentata, so not exactly what one would call a shining example of equality and diversity and respect for women. Only 2 of them have any agency, and 3 if you count Shelob. And then finally, you've got this, I will not bother reading the quote on the right there, but it is Tolkien in a letter describing orcs in a distinctly racialized terms, and this is often one of the pull quotes that people pull out to say, we need to bin Tolkien. But before we bin Tolkien, I'd like to consider a few other things about what we've just looked at. One of them is the idea of blackness as symbolism. Now, you can say that's problematic, but at the time Tolkien was writing, that was a big thing. There was black, there was white, there was good, there was evil, and so forth. And Tolkien uses the symbolism of blackness as associated with evil throughout the story, not just to do with humans, but to do with spiders, to do with forests, to do with wolves, to do with goblins, to do with mountains, to do with caves. And you can say, well, that's a wider systematic problem. But what I'm saying is Tolkien did not walk down the broad streets, clock a Nigerian undergraduate and think, follower of Sauron. He knew the difference, and his readers knew the difference. Secondly, ethnicity is actually pretty complicated in Middle-earth. There isn't a universal black people follow Sauron, white people follow Aragorn sort of division. There are actually people from both ethnic groups on different ethnic groups on different sides. Indeed, the Breelanders, who we encounter as our first friendly humans in the story, are descended from the Dunlendings, who are dark-skinned, and the Breelanders are described as swarthy. And you can interpret that as black as you want. So yeah, now we're back to our Rings of Power screenshot there. The elves and the dwarfs also have ethnic groups. This is worth noting for two reasons. One, because it does make the point that we are focusing perhaps a bit unnecessarily on the humans because of our own bias. And secondly, also for reasons I'm going to get into in the next slide, that ethnicity does not mean on Middle-earth what we think it does on our Earth. I'd also like to, but the Breelanders bring me into the ambiguous ethnicity of our main characters. Reading over the books for this volume I'm working on, one of the things I really noticed was that actually very few characters are described in terms that would allow us to pinpoint their ethnicity. Galadriel's blonde and fair-skinned, and Canna that's it. Lots of characters, including Sam, are described as dark. And in fact, there's a whole kind of Black Sam reinterpretation school that argues you could see Sam as black. And I've included a picture of Sam from the Rankin Bass Return of the King as an example of how this, if you're a casting director, you don't necessarily have to be thinking in terms of blonde Europeans for any of the main characters, with very few exceptions. I'd also raise the fact that the orcs in the novels are given characterization. They're not given nice characterization, but the orcs are also getting a damn sight more characterization than, say, the hordes of Indians in a Western. They are at the very least being given, minds, voices, thoughts, hatreds, angers, motivations. So you can't just say, these are sort of faceless, horrible hordes. These are beings, they have lives. They have senses of humor even. Awful senses of humor sometimes, but senses of humor. Now let's take a look at diversity as it's actually experienced on Middle-earth. So, as I said, I'm a professor of business anthropology. I was classically trained as an anthropologist before I wandered into a business school one day and decided the food was better. But one of the things I've kept with me is the anthropological concept of the native category. And what that means is that every society has got its own categories. This is one of the reasons that why diversity management is actually really complicated, because the initial work on diversity management was done by American academics, and American native categories about what constitutes diversity are not universally shared. And yet, sometimes people will act as if they are. I will get undergraduates turning in papers where they're like, we need to include more Latinos in our organization. I'm like, this is Britain. Find me some Latinos, and demonstrate to me that they're an oppressed category in Britain, because I don't believe it. But at the same time, there are other categories in Britain, like, say, traveling people who would not figure on the radar of American diversity metrics. There are different ways of looking at gender. There are different ways of looking at masculinity, femininity, and gender crossing in different societies. All of this to say is that in the context of Middle-earth, we need to step back and not say, okay, black men, white men, describing orcs as quote unquote Mongols. But let's look at what there is on Middle-earth. Let's look at how they define diversity. And the interesting thing is that in Middle-earth, the fault lines are not on ethnic lines. They're on lines of kind and species. It's not about if you're a black man or a white man. It's about if you're a man or an elf, or a man or a dwarf, or a man and a giant talking eagle. This is a very, very different way of looking at diversity and inclusion, and this is where the fault lines lie in Middle-earth. Gender in Middle-earth is also an awful lot more complicated than it looked. I did mention also the ambiguous gender of our characters. Well, there's kind of an interesting little bit in the appendices where Tolkien, kind of nerding out as he does about philology, says that he's actually changed the hobbits' names slightly. That in Hobbit language, the masculine ending is an A. So it's not Frodo and Bilbo, it's Froda and Bilba. But he's changed those names, he said, so that people aren't confused about the hobbit's gender. That's interesting. Is he saying that, we could read the story as Froda and Bilba? That Froda and Bilba could even be seen as feminine characters, and, it would still be the same story. That is an interesting thought. There's again the famous sort of almost throwaway appendices line that male dwarves and female dwarves look near identical and only they can tell the difference. We'll come back to that in a minute, but one thing to bear on is we've got a dozen dwarves running around the Hobbit, all with pronoun he, but are they all male? Something to think about. The absence of the Entwives. So many times in fantasy and SF, particularly mid-century fantasy and SF, we encounter effectively all male societies with maybe like one or two token sacrificial women, and this isn't questioned. I think Farah Mendelssohn referred to these as societies with no reproductive capacity, but it is insanely common, and it's almost never called out. But Tolkien does. He gives us a seemingly all-male society in the Ents, and then has the Ents say, yeah, this is a problem. We are below reproductive capacity. We don't know what's happening to the Entwives. We're worried. And this is something that pretty much everybody from Star Trek, through to, Lankmar could be doing something with. Another interesting point to note is that in the Silmarillion, you've actually got gender equity. Not equality, but equity. Namely, there are equal numbers of male and female characters in the Silmarillion, if you start crunching numbers. What does this tell us? Well, what it tells us is that the all-male review in the trilogy in Hobbit is an anomalous situation. Tolkien knows what his norm is, what his baseline is. That's what he was writing in the Silmarillion. So, what he's basically doing, Silmarillion is Britain, and Lord of the Rings, to be crude, is World War I. We're in the equivalent of the trenches. We're not seeing a normal gender situation here. He's not spelling it out, but that's what we're getting. So there's one academic who has made a point about she got blasted online because she announced she was doing a talk on queerness and Tolkien, and then she came on and she fought back. She pointed out all the number of times that the word queer is used. He's a queer fellow. They're doing something queer. Bilbo's very queer. And, people say, well, it was the 1930s. People didn't use the word queer to mean peculiar. Yeah, but in the 30s, queer did also mean gay. It did also have connotations of sexual and gender deviance, so, you can say, we can't see things from our own perspective, but nor can we erase the perspective of the time. So yeah, just a little visual aid to show you what diversity looks like on Middle-earth. And yeah, there's a lot of diversity. It's species diversity. But there is diversity. Again, that's courtesy of the Rankin Bass Hobbit. Now, you can say there's possibly not a lot of gender diversity, but like I said, how many of those dwarves are male? So where does the Lord of the Rings stand on diversity management then? Now, I will argue that the Lord of the Rings is a story that's all about diversity management. This is a story that could, in any other, in many other people's hands, have been a story about a heroic man dispossessed of his kingdom who comes back out from the wilderness and regains his kingdom and marries the princess and defeats the evil. It's not. It's about hobbits. Little guys who take a ring to a mountain and throw it in. The Hobbit, similarly, the hero story, the Conan story, is the one that takes place in about 3 paragraphs, 90% of the way through the book, about a bard who, rallies the villagers and defeats the silly bureaucrat and kills the dragon and becomes king because, kings are absolutely what a country needs, not bureaucrats. But no, the story, 90% of it is about this little guy who steals a ring and steals some treasure and rubs along with a bunch of people of a different species. So this is, if you like, an EDI story. It's taking the focus away from the straight white males who might have been the focus of a hero fantasy in any other time, and also in subsequent iterations. You look at things like, I love David Eddings, but you look at things like the Belgariad and other things that have sparked off of Tolkien. Star Wars also sparked off of Tolkien, and the straight white bloke is again centered. But in Tolkien, in Middle-earth, the person who's centered is the short people who are discriminated against because of their shortness and their sneakiness and their hairy feet and their and they're living in holes. But also, and this is where diversity management comes in, it's the abilities that the hobbits have as hobbits that makes them the ones who can fill the key role. Other people can't hold the ring. There's several attempts, to give the ring to other people, but no, Gandalf can't take the ring, Galadriel can't take the ring, Aragorn definitely can't take the ring, Boromir needs to be as far away from the ring as possible, Legolas, Gimli, none of them can take the ring, it's only the hobbits. And the straight white man is disqualified. This is a perfect example of how the diverse traits of individuals make them perfect for different roles. Similarly, one thing that the Lord of the Rings has done is it has brought the concept of diversity and skills into heroic fantasy, because here we get the fellowship, the start of this idea of the band of multi-skilled, multi-species individuals, and one's an elf and an archer, and one's a dwarf with an axe, and one's a man with a stick or a sword, and and they all have different skills, and this sort of bleeds through into the canon, so that now your standard D&D party has got the hero, the thief, the acrobat, the wizard. We all know the start of the animated Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. But this is what comes in, the idea that if you want a party, a war party, you need diverse skills, diverse people, diverse perspectives. Also, look at the way Tolkien treats boundary-spanning characters like Elrond and Bjorn. Again, it would be very easy, and quite often in the diversity management literature itself, you've got people who span boundaries kind of treated as tragic figures, people who don't fit into one world or the other. And more recently, the literature has become more celebratory, more saying that these people bridge cultures and introduce people to each other. And in Tolkien, that's just not problematic. Bjorn spans the human and the animal world, and so he stands up for the animals among the humans. Elrond bridges elf kind and mankind. We see these characters as positive figures, not tragically trapped. Other relevant subplots to do with diversity. One big thing in Lord of the Rings is the whole Legolas and Gimli friendship. And this is kind of emphasized as the fact that elves and dwarves are supposed to be historic enemies, and yet these two are friends. And throughout the story, they travel through Middle-earth, and wherever they go, somebody says, an elf and a dwarf shouldn't be friends, and they say, we are. And Legolas, when Gimli is barred in Lothlorien, Legolas says, don't bar him, he's my friend. We get repeated themes of people having their prejudices challenged through the friendship between Legolas and Gimli and the way in which they present it and the way they stand up for each other. Then you've got the issue of gender and gender nonconformity. Now, again, Éowyn's the classic example that people think of straight away. She's a woman, she dons men's clothing, she goes out to the battlefield, she fights, and then, fool, no man can kill me. I am no man. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. You cheer, and then people then say, they feel disappointed that afterwards Éowyn, she's wounded, she recovers, and then afterwards she puts on the skirts and goes back to being a princess and gets married. But I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think Tolkien was again thinking of his own experiences in World War I and more latterly in World War II, where he had seen a lot of women who were very traditional housewives and mothers effectively put on armor and go out to battle, either joining the ATS or the signalers or what have you, or else taking jobs in factories or on buses and similar, and then after the war having to go back and resume their traditional gender role. So this is kind of an observation on Tolkien's part. Éowyn kind of represents the women of what women do at war. And similarly, who does she marry? Again, people are like, oh, Tolkien should have followed his first idea and have her marry Aragorn. Now, again, that's a very sort of traditional heroic fantasy thing. She marries the hero. But no, she marries Faramir, and Faramir is also gender nonconforming. Faramir is gender shamed by his father for not being the warrior his brother is, for wanting to garden, and so I think, although again, it's not emphasized, but there's a nice touch that the two of them marry each other, perhaps with a point of sympathy about, kind of we neither of us really fit into our assigned gender roles and we can support each other. And again, the point about dwarf society and the appendices. So what is Lord of the Rings' approach to diversity management if we're talking about managers? Well, first of all, it is a very actual equal opportunities interventionist type system. This is a text, Gandalf actively recruits Bilbo even though the dwarves are prejudiced against him. Later, he recruits Frodo. And again, there's less prejudice because Bilbo's been around for a while, but nonetheless, he still has to say you need a hobbit. Gandalf and Aragorn variously act as interventionist leaders, supporting the diverse members of their band, challenging prejudice, helping people to work through their differences. Again, you've got the bands based on abilities and the fact that they don't always get on and they're not always harmonious. And so we see throughout the story the modeling of how to overcome these, how to deal with it when you've got a leader like Thorin who's constantly snubbing you for your abilities or your background, how to deal with it when you encounter active hostility. But then we get to the problematic E. Tolkien, I would say, is not about equality, but possibly he's about the other sort of E. He's about the equity. Middle-earth society is hierarchical. Lord of the Rings is fundamentally hierarchical. Hierarchies are kind of seen as a good thing. There is this that whole thing about when Bard becomes king, and it's sort of like, oh, and they went back to having a king because people need kings and kings are good. End of. But one of the points of the hierarchies in Lord of the Rings is they're not necessarily inborn or unchangeable. Tolkien kind of has a meritocratic view of hierarchy, which is that the good people will rise to the top, you know. But that does mean that the hierarchy isn't unchangeable. Sometimes the good people need to rise. But also, one very important thing is that in the text, followership is as important as leadership. This is not a story where the leaders are the only good ones. It's over and over. You know, Frodo and Sam, you know, everybody, we learn that followership is every bit as important as leadership, and leaders don't work without followers. So the fact that there's a hierarchy doesn't mean that the guy on top is worth more than the guy on the bottom, and that the guy on top needs to remember this. Now, the scouring of the Shire sequence again, can be seen as a swipe at meritocratic EDI sort of practices. This idea that, you know, the new leadership of the Shire will kind of make, take the money and then spread it out equally, you know. But the point of it is not that Tolkien is unsympathetic to the idea of welfare. It's that he really is having a swipe at performative welfare. You know, there's a thing about, you know, he takes all the grain and he says he's going to redistribute it, but somehow none of it gets redistributed. You know, this is a swipe at people who say we're going to make a diverse workforce, and yet, you know, the protected category people get stuck in the entry-level positions and never rise. Later adaptations, why it matters. As I've given a few examples, in James Tiptree Jr.'s Up the Walls of the World, there's sort of a stereotypical hippie Tolkien nerd who has taken the name of Frodo, but it's worth noting that that character is gendered female. We see increased roles for the female characters in the Jackson films and Rings of Power, and controversially, ethnically diverse casting in Rings. But why does this happen? Why is this significant? I think it's because the texts are so resonant that people say, you know, I want to see myself. Who would someone like me be on Middle-earth? And I don't mean they say, you know, well, I'm black, so I want Aragorn to be black, although why not? But they are saying, I'm black. What would it be like to be a Southrunner or a Breelander in Middle-earth? You know, I'm a woman. What would that be? Then again, also later adaptations, you know, Terry Pratchett in Discworld really ran with the idea that you can't tell dwarf men from women, and turned a whole transgender positive subplot, got a whole transgender subplot out of it. And also he really ran in the Ankh-Morpork novels with the idea of discrimination based on kind, and on how, you know, modern models of diversity might map out onto a Tolkien sort of universe. Dungeons and Dragons, you know, Tolkien with the serial numbers filed off, but famously people have played with that, you know. Orcs are no longer, you know, necessarily villains, you know. You can be an orc or a half orc, and, you know, there are lots of half characters. So, you know, people want to see themselves, and they want, you know, then they, so they write themselves into the narrative through writing the missing bits. So just briefly, how does this work in terms of diversity management? What can we do to use Lord of the Rings to improve our diversity management? Well, one of them is that people who find it hard to think of white men versus protected categories might find it easier to think about men, elves, dwarves, and hobbits, and so forth. You know, often one way of getting around people's prejudices can be to frame that same prejudice in lines of things that don't directly relate to it. You know, you are, don't think of it in terms of, you know, hiring policies that bring in quotas of women. Think about the fact that Gandalf had to actively bring Bilbo into Thorin's band. And so you can use Lord of the Rings to explain these sorts of policies and the rationales behind them, to encourage empathy and knowledge through things like the Legolas-Gimli relationship and the figures of Elrond and Bjorn, and also to develop exercises and games. You know, do you play a round of Dungeons and Dragons and use it for talking points about diversity, empathy, equity, and the reasons for it? You can also talk about the ways in which leadership acts to identify talent, encourage it, and develop a pipeline in the series. The role of co-workers as champions, supporters, and allies. Battle and campaign metaphors. This is one of the most successful things with the Game of Thrones book, telling people if you think your work is boring, think of it in terms of a battle, think of it as a campaign. So, do the same with Lord of the Rings. And finally, think about Tolkien's real life sources. Think about the fact that this was not coming out of nowhere, that Tolkien was living at a time when people were talking about gender roles, talking about ethnic diversity, where people were, actively not just actively discriminating, but there was, a literal war going on about a genocide, and again, about the different roles people in society played and how they changed. That's Eowyn in War of the Rohirrim, by the way. Okay, so we've got 8 minutes left for questions, so I'll bring Shana up and also say that while the book won't be coming out till next year at the earliest, I do waffle on a lot more about this sort of thing at my blog, so if I haven't put you off thoroughly, you can go visit that.